Welcome back to Wrong Sports as I cover my How the Year Was Won series through World War II. We're now in the final year of this series. It's now 1945, and in the fall of 1945, Europe was not in total war anymore, as the Germans had been defeated in the spring of that year. The 2 atomic bombs had been dropped on Japan about a month or so before the 1945 college football season, and that would signal the end of World War II very soon. But since the end of the war came so late in the summer, many of the troops that were fighting and stationed in Europe and in the Pacific were not yet back in the country. This meant that colleges all around the United States would not have the manpower just yet. That wouldn't happen until the following spring and even into the fall of 1946. But that didn't mean that colleges shuttered or college football teams shuttered like in 1943. This would instead have an effect on the service college football teams that popped up during World War II, as they were either shuttered or combined with another base nearby, or maybe even changing their name. The name changes were mostly seen with the Army Air Force bases that had named in relations to their location. Example would be Randolph Field, who I mentioned in my service teams documentaries that I have on my Patreon right now. They went 11-0 in 1944, and they were named the Army Air Force Training Command Team in 1945, and they would also be playing in the Army Air Force League. And with the many name changes and service teams that shuttered, that also meant that these service teams would not be playing college football teams too much in the year of 1945. In my previous video of 1944, I mentioned how in the final AP Top 5, like the whole top 10 were pretty much service teams along with Army and Navy. So in 1945, there will not be that many service teams, and pretty much none at all that will be coming up that I will be talking about in depth in this series. If you want to hear more about service teams and the bowl games that they went to and the best college football service teams during this time, make sure you head to my Patreon right now, patreon.com/wrongsports. And I wanted to mention that because this is going to feel a lot like I'm reverting back to 1941, or the first episode in this series, because you're going to be hearing a lot more about college football teams instead of service teams. And that's also a big reason why I wanted to bookend this series with 1941 and 1945. But before I get into the big names and the big games and the big teams in 1945, make sure as always you are subscribed to the channel below. Hit that bell so you can get updates on more videos that I will be dropping all throughout the spring. I'm going to be having those college basketball videos coming out. Plus, you can also check out my service college football teams. I talked all about them in my previous episodes and a little bit before. Patreon.com/wrongsports. Link also in the description below. And as always, like this video and share this video with other college sports fans. Let's cover some of the top teams from last year going into this season. The best team, of course, was Army, who would have most of their team back from their record-breaking 1944 season. The 2 most noteworthy losses, though, were going to be All-American Joseph Stanowitz and their Hall of Fame quarterback, Doug Kenna. Replacing linemen wouldn't be hard, and also they had plenty of quarterbacks on their roster, so they would just throw in a new quarterback for 1945 as they would use Arnold Tucker. Tucker had already had some playing time under his belt, as he had played at Miami of Florida in 1943 as a freshman, and when their roster was decimated by war call-ups and they didn't play at all in 1944, he was called to West Point during the season and would sit out, so this would be his first playing time since 1943. Tucker was an important cog in their offense, but there were 2 bigger newcomers that would be coming to Army this season. The biggest newcomer was a fullback in Tom "Shorty" McWilliams. Even though he had the nickname Shorty, McWilliams was actually 6'3". He had played for Mississippi State in 1944 and was one of their best offensive weapons. And he would be an amazingly dangerous weapon that would be added to this already dangerous backfield of Blanchard, Davis, and McWilliams, who would now have Tucker at quarterback. So the additional weapon only made Army even scarier this year, as both of their ends, Hank Foldberg and Barney Poole, who I mentioned last year, would also be back, as well as 4 out of their 5 starting linemen from the previous season were back. Oh, and by the way, all of them were All-Americans or finalists for the All-American team. So this Army team were already awesome, and they would become even better with those additions. But I'll get into Army and their season in just a little bit because I got to cover their top rival in Navy, who is also getting ready for another big season. They would still be coached by Oscar Hagberg. Navy would have turnover on their line, but they would score a big addition as they would manage to get Robert Hornschmeyer, who had led the NCAA in total offense as a 17-year-old at Indiana, and then played a few games in 1944 for them before he came to the Naval Academy just before the end of 1944. Hornschmeyer was a great speedy back that whenever he played for Indiana in 1943 and 44, they usually won or had a chance to win, which showed just how much of a game changer he was. And he would be needed mostly to increase the offense of Navy's team, and also to try and just beat Army this year, but we'll get into that shortly. I wanted to give an introduction to Army and Navy since you will be hearing a lot about them, but I also wanted to cover a few other important teams this year like Alabama, Indiana, and also Oklahoma State. Let's cover Alabama first, as they were coming off of a 5-2-2 season in 1944, where they went to the Sugar Bowl but lost. This would be a big feat because Alabama was not part of the V-12 program or the Army training program, so they weren't getting any big transfers to come to them before they shipped off. Instead, Alabama, like most of the SEC, would sit out for 1943 because they were so slim in terms of athletes and students on campus. And that year off would be needed because they would come back in 1944 as they managed to have just enough freshmen and sophomores to field the team, which was named the War Babies by their coach Frank Thomas. That was because the Crimson Tide's offense mostly contained freshmen, sophomores, or players that were not fit for the armed service. With such a young team, not much was predicted, so the winning season was quite a surprise. When the 1945 team got on the field, they were still very young as those freshmen became sophomores and the sophomores became juniors, but still, that was very young compared to the other teams that would be going on the field, as most of them were seniors or post-grad students or maybe even professional players. Gonna cover Oklahoma State now next because I'm not gonna be talking about them too much throughout the season, mostly towards the beginning and then towards the end. They were coached by Jim Lukabaugh, who had started at Oklahoma A&M in 1939, and since then the team had hovered around 500, and they had never won the Missouri Valley Conference. Due to that, they didn't get much attention until late in the season of 1944, where they went 8-1, and they would also rout TCU 34-0 in the Cotton Bowl. Along with that, they would be bringing back a future Hall of Famer in Bob Fenimore, who was an All-American in 1944 and led the nation in rushing and total offense, as he had 1,119 rushing yards and over 1,700 in total yardage. Since they were playing in the considered mid-major conference of the Missouri Valley Conference, they started the season unranked, but eventually would get back into the ranking. I gotta start this season though, because I gotta start with Michigan as always. Michigan would always have a tough schedule, and they would have another tough schedule this year. You'll be hearing a lot about them because they're gonna be playing the top 3 teams this year, as well as help to start some pretty significant new system in college football. What I mean by that is that from the start of college football until 1945, if you played offense, you would also pretty much play defense and pretty much would play most of the game, if not all game. That would start the change, though, with Michigan head coach Fritz Kreisler, who would experiment with using a 2-platoon system this year. He had apparently used a 2-platoon system in 1943 and 44 for a few games where he wanted to give some of his players a rest, but in 1945, he would use it more often, to where people and other coaches started to notice and use it in their future teams. Michigan would be coming into the 1945 season with a lot of roster changes, like all teams. But Michigan lost pretty much all of their starters from 1944, with the exception of like 2 players. One of their biggest losses was Bob Weiss, who would be called to the armed forces and leave after the 1944 season. He would return to Michigan, though, in 1946. Chrysler, though, would also have his top quarterback back in Joe Ponsetto and his center Harold Watts. But still, Chrysler was pretty confident in his team, and it showed in their first game versus Great Lakes Navy, who were still coached by Paul Brown, and they had a great backfield with their quarterback George Turlip, who won a national title with Notre Dame in 1943. They also had Frank Aschenbrenner and fullback Marion Motley, who would go on to play for the Cleveland Browns after the war. But even though they were coming in with a great team on paper, they were hastily put together in the last month or so, and they really weren't even supposed to be playing in the 1945 season. I go over this team a lot in the 1943 season as well in my Patreon exclusive, so make sure you check them out, patreon.com/wrongsports. This team was pretty much hastily put together because they thought that the base was going to shut down, and it would pretty soon, and they didn't think they would be having a football team this season, as Paul Brown actually signed that contract to be head coach and basically general manager for the new Cleveland Browns franchise. So when he was told that he would have to coach a team for 1945, he basically just put together a team with anyone who was left on the base who had any sort of experience. And it showed, because in the game, the Great Lakes squad could not get in the end zone or really get close to the end zone, as they would lose 27-2 on 2 touchdown passes from Michigan. Michigan's next game would be against the conference opponent in Indiana. So here, I'm going back to Indiana. They were considered a mid-level conference team since they started playing football at the start of 1900, as they never won the Big 9 or the Big 10 conference since it started. And they really only finished second or third a handful of times. That would start to change, though, in 1934, as hired Kansas State coach and college football legend Bo McMillin. If you don't know the name McMillin, he made a name for himself as the small school legend for Central College when he led them to beat Harvard in 1921, giving the Crimson their first loss in 2 years. After that, McMillin was an All-American and would start to play professionally for a few years. He then would coach at Centenary College, then Geneva, before going to Kansas State. After Kansas State, McMillin came to Indiana and would have 5 winning seasons in his first 12 years, but could never get into the top 2 in the conference. But with the team this year, he would get into the upper echelon. That was because the team would feature all Big Ten quarterback Ben Raimondi, who transferred from William and Mary and had started for the Tribe there for a few games. Along with that, Pete Philos, who was an All-American in 1943, but had to take off in 1944 for war commitments, would be back for 1945. As well as them, they would have 2 new players that would hit the field this season that were African-American, which the Big Ten really didn't have too many athletes of. The first was Mel Grooms, who came to Indiana in 1944, but was mostly a third stringer. In 1945, though, he would start most of the games and would make an impact. Along with him, another new addition was George Taliaferro, who would be a great pairing with the returning Philos, and would also be a good fill-in for Philos since he wasn't discharged until after the second game. So Taliaferro would actually have to play versus Michigan, and he would do pretty fantastic in this game, as he would get 20 carries for 95 yards, and Raimondi would have 2 touchdown passes, with 1 going to Mel Grooms, the freshman, to give Indiana the 13-7 win. After that big win, Indiana would have quite the struggle on September 29th, as they would play Northwestern, as Northwestern didn't let Indiana into the end zone until the 4th quarter. And this was even with the fact that Indiana had 152 rushing yards and 133 passing yards. But turnovers and dropped passes really hurt them, so they would pretty much have to play catch-up most of the game. That late touchdown helped them get back into it as they tied it up 7-7, but nothing else would happen and the game would end in a tie. That tie would not help them in the rankings, which I will get to in just a moment, as Indiana would get back into the winning swing, as on October 6th, they held Illinois scoreless. Indiana was also held scoreless as well, but not without some weirdness, as according to news accounts, Mel Grooms had thrown a touchdown pass in the second quarter, but it was called back because a Great Dane had gotten loose on the field, so Indiana had to wait until the fourth quarter to get their game-winning touchdown. That would give them the 6-0 win and the 2-0-1 record that would place Indiana in the first AP poll of the year. But they weren't in the top 5, as instead they were ranked 8th, with Army at number 1, Navy at number 2, and Notre Dame at number 3. Then Big Ten schools Ohio State and Minnesota closed out the top 5. But don't worry, that would not last very long, because I will be getting back to Army now, as on October 13th, Army would have a big game as they would play Michigan. Michigan had the loss already to Indiana, but everyone knew that this was going to be a tough game for Army, and it was their toughest game, as Army had started their season by destroying an Army Air Force command team, and then Wake Forest by shutout, and they scored over 40 points per game in both of those wins, so basically just continuing their destruction from 1944. Army's scary offense would not be able to be as dominant in this Michigan game. That was due to Chrysler using that 2-platoon system, which I mentioned, which helped his players keep Army scoreless for the first quarter. However, Army, behind 2 touchdowns from Blanchard and 1 from Davis, would take a commanding lead eventually and hold on to win 28-7. But the 2-platoon system would be used all over college football in the next few years, and Army's coach Earl Blake even started to use it a few years later, giving the nod to Chrysler. For the weekend of October 20th, there was really only one game that had an important team in, and that would be Alabama, as they played Tennessee at home. Both teams were 3-0, but Alabama had the tougher schedule thus far. Alabama played South Carolina and SEC team LSU on the road. LSU would be one of the top 4 teams in the league at the end of the season. This game would be a lot like that LSU game, as Alabama had a big lead at half and would hold on to win 25-7. Through 4 games, Alabama had scored 30-plus points per game and had only given up 2 touchdowns total. With the win, Alabama was still, though, outside of the top 5, as Purdue now would be in the top 5 as they got to number 4 after they beat Ohio State, and the top 3 would also stay the same from the previous time I mentioned. Going into the next week, and I'm going to stay with Alabama, who would have another top SEC team in Georgia on their schedule, and Georgia had suffered a loss the previous weekend to LSU, so if they could beat Alabama, it would put the SEC in turmoil. But unfortunately that didn't happen, as Georgia did score early, but couldn't keep up with Alabama's defense or their offense, as their quarterback Harry Gilmer threw 3 touchdown passes to give Alabama the 28-14 win. But I can't get into the AP poll just yet because I have to go to these other 2 games that had the 2 top teams in them in Army and Navy. First off, though, Navy would travel to Philly to play the undefeated Penn squad that had not lost too many players to war and were a competent opponent to the Navy and Army teams. The game was a close and hard-fought battle, as it was tied until a late Navy score, so the game ended 14-7. But while Navy was having that hard-fought, tough win, Army would continue to roll, as they would score 48 points in the first 3 quarters, with Blanchard scoring twice and Davis scoring again to give them the 48-13 win. And this win was pretty significant, since Duke was Army's second toughest game the previous year, and Army steamrolled them this year. With Navy and Army both winning, they would both stay at number 3 and number 1 respectively, with Notre Dame at number 2. But that would change with the first weekend of November, as November 3rd would see 2 of the top 3 teams face off, as Navy would play Notre Dame. Navy had won the previous year, but Notre Dame had won the rivalry most of the last decade. The game was played again in Cleveland, Ohio, and the winner of this would have the best path to the national title, as both would have to play Army after this. The game was a hard-fought battle, and neither team really had any advantage, so the game would end in a 6-6 tie, keeping both teams unbeaten and also keeping them both in the top 5, except Navy would fall from number 3 to number 4 as Alabama jumped them, and Notre Dame stayed at number 2. I would go over the rest of the top 5, but a ton of the rankings would change over the next week because the weekend of November 10th would see 4 big games with top 10 teams in them. I'm going to go to the biggest one first, with number 2 versus number 1 as Notre Dame traveled to Yankee Stadium to play Army. Here we go. This game was not like the previous week though for Notre Dame, as Army beat them early and beat them often. This game was such a blowout. Davis scored 2 touchdowns in the first quarter and scored a third one later, while Blanchard would also score twice before the third quarter was over. Even with Army sending in their backups in the second half, Notre Dame couldn't do a thing, and Army won 48-0, showing just how good Army was this year. I say that because Navy, who had tied Notre Dame the previous week, was going to move up the polls as they played Michigan the same day. Michigan did score twice on Army earlier in the season, mostly against the backups of Army, but they did lose in Army's closest game so far, and then Michigan would rebound after that Army loss to win their next 2 games by shutout. In this game, though, Michigan had a worse showing, as they scored only once, while Navy would outrush Michigan 235-68, scoring 5 times to give Navy the really good 33-7 win. But I can't leave the week yet because there were 2 more games with some polling circumstances. The first one was with the unbeaten Indiana squad as they played Minnesota. Indiana were still rolling after that Michigan win as they won their next 4 games by wide margins, and they were scoring 40+ more points per game in all of them. That was because their rushing game was pretty unstoppable with Philos and Talaferro. The only close call during these 4 games was when Indiana faced off against Tulsa, who I will get into in just a moment. Meanwhile, Indiana's opponent in this week's game was Minnesota, who were welcoming back their legendary coach Bernie Bierman, as he was discharged before the season and came back to the school to try and bring them back to the national title contention. Minnesota would start off by winning their first 4 games, but then fell to Ohio State and Michigan in consecutive weeks, and it wouldn't get any better as versus Indiana, Talaferro would return the opening kickoff for a touchdown, and then Indiana would add 4 more touchdowns before half to put this game out of reach, with Indiana winning and continuing their unbeaten season, winning 49-0. So while I was zooming through Indiana's mid-season, I mentioned how their closest game was against Tulsa, and that's who I'm going to get into a little bit right now because they started their season 5-0 before they lost to Indiana. They showed a lot because they managed to stop the Indiana offense all game, as Tulsa only lost to Indiana 7-2. Tulsa would though have 1 week off before they would have to go and play their toughest conference game, as they would play Oklahoma A&M in Stillwater. I covered the Cowboys team earlier a little bit, but when the season started, they were strong and they kept it going. That was mostly because they had their best player, Bob Fenimore, running and passing to help the Pokes offense average 25 points per game. Their defense, meanwhile, wasn't great, but it was good enough to only give up 10 points per game, which allowed them to win pretty much all their games very easily. Oklahoma A&M's schedule, however, wasn't the greatest, even though they played big-name teams like Oklahoma, Arkansas, and SMU, but none of these teams had winning records, and since they also played in the Missouri Valley Conference, which was a mid-level conference, Oklahoma A&M were only ranked number 11 when Tulsa came to town to play them. Tulsa, with their one loss, were ranked number 19, so this would be the highest ranked game for Oklahoma A&M, and it would be the biggest game of the season and would pretty much be the Missouri Valley Conference title game as well. Over 18,000 people would show up to see a close game that looked like it would go Tulsa's way, until Oklahoma A&M, behind Fenimore, would pull it out to win 12-6. Due to Oklahoma A&M's win, they got up into the top 10 as they were ranked number 8. However, though, Army was still going to be number 1 as they had 81 of 82 first-place votes, with Navy at number 2, Alabama at number 3, who actually had the other first-place vote, Indiana State at number 4, who were just slightly ahead of Army's next opponent in Penn. And with Army going to Philly to play Penn were looking for a big upset win, or at least to keep it close, since Penn had lost a close game to Navy just a few days before Halloween. Penn would rebound by winning their next 2, including beating a formerly undefeated and ranked number 10 team Columbia to get back to be ranked number 6 before this game. But like every opponent thus far, it didn't really matter to Army, who would wipe the floor with Penn, as Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside had their best games of the season, as Davis and Blanchard would both have 3 touchdowns apiece, giving Army more than half of their points scored this game, and also Penn couldn't really do anything as they really couldn't get even close to the 20-yard line. Army would win this game 61-0, but according to game reports, this could have been much worse, as Army fumbled 4 times in this game. Penn recovered all 4 of them, but they still couldn't score off any of those fumbles. Army would also pull Davis and Blanchard as well in the third quarter, but that still didn't even matter. After the monster win, Army would stay number 1 and pretty much be the unanimous number 1, Navy number 2, Alabama number 3, and still unbeaten, Indiana would stay at number 4. Now in the final weekend of November, it had no Army or Navy game, as they got ready for their game coming up December 1st. Indiana, though, would close their season this week, as they would end their season with a 3rd straight shutout as they beat number 18 Purdue 26-0. The win would give Indiana their first unbeaten season and their first ever Big Ten title. But since the Big Ten had no deal with the Rose Bowl just yet that would actually start next season, Indiana's season was over, and they would have to wait until the final poll to see where they would be ranked. That final poll would come out after the games on December 1st. Alabama would end their season beating a service team from Pensacola. This was a late addition, apparently. Plus Notre Dame, who only had 1 loss, and they did have a slight chance for the national title. It was very slight. They were mostly hoping for Navy to beat Army just slightly, or maybe even a tie might help them, but it was very slight, and they really were just playing for pride at this point. They played the service team from Great Lakes Navy to finish off their season, and I have gone over Great Lakes Navy before, and they were one of the most fascinating teams that played during World War II. I mentioned how they were coached by Paul Brown, who really didn't think he was going to be coaching this season, as he was getting a professional team ready for the start of his Cleveland Browns team in the All-American Football Conference that was going to start in 1946. So this team seemed pretty checked out when they started the season, because they started 0-4-1, but then they turned it on by winning 5 straight coming into this final game versus Notre Dame. The game was going to be taking place in Chicago at the Naval Base on a field that would be demolished once this game was over. Coach Paul Brown got word a week before the game that many of his players would be eligible for immediate discharge, like his top running back Marion Motley. That meant that they could all leave and they didn't have to play in the Notre Dame game. Instead, though, most of those players would still stay around to play in this game. Meanwhile, Notre Dame really didn't take this game too seriously, as they had played what many thought were the 2 best teams already. And it would show, as Great Lakes scored first on a run by Motley, and Notre Dame would score to get it close, but that was all the scoring they did, as Great Lakes Navy scored 4 times in 1 quarter, a feat that not even Army or Navy had done, and that would pretty much seal it for Great Lakes Navy, who would conclude their season and their service college football run by winning 39-7. The send-off win was a perfect ending for this service squad, and again, I talk about them a lot in my list of of greatest service college football teams. You can check that out on my Patreon right now, patreon.com/wrongsports. Link also in the description below. But along with that upset for the second consecutive season, Army was ranked number 1 and Navy would be ranked number 2 in the AP poll coming into this final game. 102,000 people would show up in the massive Philadelphia Municipal Stadium, which is one of my favorite stadiums to cover. I mean, look at this thing. It's massive. It held over 100,000 people and was like rarely used. Pretty much no one used it. Army and Navy would play just about 36 games here. They used the stadium the most, but really no professional team used it. Live Aid used it. That's where I get a lot of these pictures from. So I just wanted to mention this stadium because I think it's a really cool, gigantic stadium. Like I said, 102,000 people showed up to see this game, with some sports writers calling this game another game of the century. Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis came into this game both with 16 touchdowns apiece. And sports writers were saying whoever scored the most would win the Heisman Trophy. Blanchard would be the one who would score the national scoring title, as he got 3 touchdowns to Davis's 2 and give Army their 9th win of the season and their 18th straight as they beat Navy again 32-13. Navy finished their season 7-1-1 and would still be ranked number 2 in the final poll, while Army was named the number 1 team and the national champion. Army and Navy pretty much had the same schedule, as both of these teams played number 8 Notre Dame, number 9 Duke, number 7 Penn, and number 6 Michigan. Both Army and Navy would beat the last 3, with the only difference being that Navy tied Notre Dame, while Army wiped the floor with Notre Dame. Army would gain all of the first place votes in this final poll, and that was even with an undefeated Alabama and unbeaten Indiana, and also that undefeated Oklahoma A&M team, who finished number 3rd, number 4, and number 5 respectively. And speaking of the number 3 team, Alabama, they would be invited and accept to go to LA to go to the Rose Bowl to play USC, while the number 5 team, Oklahoma A&M, would accept the invite to the Sugar Bowl to play St. Mary's. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the Rose Bowl, since I really didn't mention them last year, because last year was like almost a service game of sorts, since Washington came into the game having a bunch of V12 recruits. That wouldn't happen this year because USC managed to get Alabama to come to the game, and Alabama had a pretty good record going into this Rose Bowl game, as they were 4-1-1 in previous Rose Bowl games. Their opponents, Southern Cal, were even better in the Rose Bowl, as they were undefeated up to this point. They were 8-0, but USC were unimpressive this season, as they were 7-3. So it was little surprise, except perhaps to maybe Trojan fans, when Alabama whipped USC 34-14. The Sugar Bowl, meanwhile, would be a great showing for Oklahoma A&M, as they won 33-13 over St. Mary's, and having them end their season undefeated. But even though those two teams were undefeated and Indiana were unbeaten, this Army team this year is considered one of the greatest college football teams of all time, and it's really tough to argue because this team not only beat, but they embarrassed a handful of top 10 teams like I mentioned. Army would continue being a great team all the way until 1951, when a big academic scandal hit them. It's another thing I have covered in a previous video, and I will put a link in the description below. But after this season, college football would go through a ton of changes, and they would go through a ton of changes that would really help to shape the NCAA and college football, as the NCAA would introduce a pretty much whole new administration. We would have a commissioner, we would have rules and regulations, and yeah, there would just be so many changes over the next 70 years or so. So the 1945 season was really one of the last seasons where really you could do anything you wanted. And if you want to see a little bit on how college football changed from this season in 1945 over the next 5 seasons, I did a How the Year Was Won 1950 in college football and 1951. You can check that out in the link below. I'll also put that in the card at the end of this video, so you can check that out. But tell me what you think about service college football during World War II. Also, tell me what you think about these Army teams from 1944 and 1945. As always, thank you so much for checking out this video. Like and share this video. Check out my Patreon. Help out my channel, patreon.com/wrongsports. Have a fantastic rest of your day.